All right, welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about habitat selection, and this is meant to be the second part of the lecture that I typically do. I do one on foraging and then one on habitat selection, and those two things go together, as you might imagine. So a lot of times I like to start off with two very different looking habitats, this one here and this one here, and ask people, which one do you want to go to? If we're going on vacation, where would you want to go? And most of the time people, not always, but most of the time people go, oh yeah, this one right here, because this looks very harsh and it's deserty and there's one palm tree there and that kind of thing. And then I ask, do you think all animals pick this one? And of course the answer is no, because there's some animals that are adapted to survive in the desert. And so that's where we kind of get into the fact that it's not just the perfect habitat. It's there's several other factors like the kind of animal you are and that kind of thing. So one big thing that you might imagine that affects habitat selection, where an animal might live, is food, which we already talked about before. And why would you expect that? Why would they pick a particular habitat to live in one versus another? Well, you got to have food. So that's an important one. And a long time ago, a very famous animal behaviorist by the name of Manfred Malinsky came up with this thing called this model called the ideal free distribution. And in the ideal free distribution, the idea was that animals distribute themselves based on the presence or absence of food, relative amounts of food. And he did a really neat study with these fish called a three-spined stickleback that you can see right here, and had this neat experiment where he could drop in different amounts of the food. And this particular fish, in this case, they're eating these little things called water fleas, which they really aren't fleas, but they're a little type of small arthropod, very tiny. You can kind of see them with the naked eye, but with a microscope is usually how we look at them. And anyway, you could drop them in, and depending on how much, if you put a lot of food on one side versus the other, the fish would distribute themselves relative to the amount of food. And that was a really neat experiment. And you could switch, like later on, you could make this side have more food. And that kind of, sort of reinforced that idea that food was important. Other people came along, and this is just one example. Parker and Sutherland didn't really disagree with the idea of the ideal free distribution, but said, there's a little bit more to it than that. And they sort of enhanced the ideal free distribution and included what they called instead the competitive unit model, sort of just a slight adjustment to the ideal free distribution, saying that although this is true that they distribute themselves based on food, the other factor is how competitive individuals are in that group. So for example, this sort of assumes all of the fish are just as competitive as another. But if you had one like really hardcore, tough fish, and there was a lot of food coming in, but this thing was like, big and mean and was a total butt kicker kind of thing, well, the fish might still go over here, even though there's less food, because of the competitive unit model, as an example. Another thing that's interesting, and one of my favorite graphs and studies, so I'm definitely going to put this on a quiz or exam, is this idea of how genetics and experience can kind of work together. So in this particular study, which is a really nicely done study in my opinion, they took mice and they let them pick habitat. They let them pick whether they chose to sleep and make their beds on a cellulose-based bed, which is like a plant material, and then another plant material, cedar. And cedar is usually associated with wood that has like a kind of an insect repellent nature to it. I'm sure there's a lot more known about it than that. But anyway, in a lot of furniture and things of that sort, they often use cedar because insects don't seem to eat cedar, kind of like redwood. So what they did was they took females and they took males mice, and they gave them a chance to pick which one they liked. Are they going to sleep on the cellulose-based bed or the cedar-based bed? And then they did it over a couple of different days, and they did it with different ages of mice. So, for example, if we start with the females first, and if you look over here, this is the 50% mark, meaning that any graph that hits that line, it's 50-50. There's no difference. Like, they like cellulose just as much as they like cedar. So this over here, as you can see, says the number of cellulose observations. So if you take a mouse that you originally raised on cellulose, female, and you put her in and you let her pick, since this is over the 5, 80% of the time on day 1, a young female mouse picks cellulose. But you see, it doesn't take her very long to where she ends up being on the cellulose about maybe 30% of the time, 35% of the time, which means instead she's picking cedar. So, and then that's even more enhanced if you use an older mouse. So you take a 60-day-old mouse who was raised on cellulose as a baby, okay? And she's 60 days old now, which I guess, is a grown-up mouse. Anyway, 60-day-old mouse. On day 1, right away, they're kind of half and half, and it doesn't take them long, but a female mouse ends up picking cedar, because again, the higher this number is, that means there's more cellulose observations. So the lower it is, that means there's less cellulose observations, and therefore they're picking cedar. So in the case of a cellulose raised mouse, a female mouse, particularly 60 days old, there seems to be a genetic preference for them to pick cedar. That's even more so and reinforced if you add the how they're raised part. Okay, so if you raise a female mouse on cedar, they go right to the cedar. They have a cedar preference. Okay, those are females. Now look at the males over here. So what happens with the males, if you raise them on cellulose, they pick cellulose. If you raise them on cedar, they pick cedar. So what this sort of shows us in this nice example with these graphs is that for female mice, at least, there seems to be a pretty strong genetic component for habitat selection, and they tend to pick what they were raised on. They seem to go to that pretty quickly. But the males, on the other hand, doesn't seem so genetic. It seems more driven by what they experienced when they were young. And so in this particular case, we see that the male mice they end up picking cedar if they're raised on it, but they pick cellulose if they were raised on that. Okay. Another study where they took this bird called a chipping sparrow, and they looked at how much time it spent in different habitats. And if you caught wild chipping sparrows and you put them in the aviary where they could fly around, and you have these trees inside where they can pick, and you can kind of monitor where they go, wild chipping sparrows pick pine trees 71% of the time. They seem to like pine trees. I'm guessing, I don't know, but maybe there's a certain kind of food they eat there. Maybe there's nesting material they use. I'm sure that's known somewhere. So in this particular case, what I'm just showing you is if you just watch where they go, they seem to like pine trees. If you raise them in a lab, so here we have laboratory reared, no foliage, so they didn't see either tree, or laboratory reared oak foliage only. If you raise them in a lab with no foliage, you can see they still like pine trees. So there seems to be a genetic component where they like pine trees. If they're raised in the lab and they see oak trees, you can see that there's an influence definitely of early experience, because they start to favor oak trees. It's about half and half. So it's not purely genetic. It's influenced by what they're experiencing. But it appears if they've never seen anything, they have a natural preference for oak trees. But pine trees. But you can override that by experiencing them oak trees, giving them oak tree experience early on. Okay. Now, a couple of terms that we're going to talk about here. When we talk about habitat, we're going to often talk about food, which we talked about in the other lecture. And a place where an animal is looking for food, they call that a patch. So within a particular area where the food is, a small area is called a patch. And an animal might search for food in one area or that patch. And if it doesn't find food, it might move on to a nearby area, and then we would call that a different patch. The home range is all the area that an animal lives during its lifetime. And so we'll talk a little bit about the difference here between home range and territory. But some animals defend territories where they'll fight you and attack another animal if it comes into a smaller subset of an area. But they usually have outside that territory a larger range called the home range where they might wander around. And then some animals do some crazy long distance movement within habitats, and we call that migration, which is the long distance movement and return usually, and if you don't make it, from one habitat location to another. And that can change. So here's an interesting study where they took this bird called a yellow-eyed junco, and they kind of would look at what kind of habitat they picked. And they would give it two different sort of scenarios. One was variable, meaning that it might get either 0 seeds or 6 seeds. And the other was constant, where you get 3 seeds. So it's kind of interesting. You can think about your personality here. Are you a gambler or not? So someone like me, for example, I'm not a gambler. I don't like to take chances. So I would be over here. I'd be this 3 seed person if I could. My wife always likes to take these gambles on things like, let's let it roll. Let's try it out. And I usually disagree with her on that. And sometimes she's right. Sometimes I'm right. But that's just how it goes. Anyway, there are some people that are gamblers and like to take the risk. And that's what this bird does sometimes too. Now, what they found is, well, first of all, let's talk about this. If you are risk averse, that's kind of like how I am, right? I try to avoid the risk. Risk averse means you're avoiding risk. Risk prone means you're like a gambler. Like my wife, you're willing to take a little bit of risk, not just for fun, but the idea is there's a bigger reward. That's called risk prone. And what they found is these birds are risk averse at 19 degrees Celsius, but they become risk prone at 1 degree Celsius. And what they found out is that the birds will pick this one under normal temperatures and circumstances because it gets enough food and it's consistent. But as it gets cold, down to 1 degree, they start expending more energy to try to stay warm because they're birds. And turns out they can't survive on 3 seeds. They need 4, 5, or 6 seeds. And that's probably a rate or the way they find it or something. So they'll switch. They become risk prone at 1 degree Celsius. They switch their behavior. Same bird, yellow-eyed junco, switches its behavior, becomes risk prone, accepts risks as a gambler. Probably in part, as I said, they can't survive on the smaller amount of food. A lot of animals also defend territories. They often use this for mating sites, and that's why they'll defend a territory. And different animals defend different kinds of territories. This kind of crazy looking fly here is called an antlered fly. And the antlered flies defend territories on a rotten log. So a log falls down, and the antler flies use those. The males fight over those because females like the logs, probably for egg-laying sites. And so the male that has the best log gets the females, and so they'll defend that resource in that way. That's called a territory. This is another example of a territory here. Everybody probably should know at this point my fondness for lizards of all sorts. This is a very common lizard around us here called a side-blotched lizard. Side-blotched lizard. These aren't the ones in our sanctuary usually, or on your fence. They're similar. These are more kind of in a desert or sandy kind of region. We do have them around us, but anyway, side blotch lizards. And they sit on rocks like lots of lizards do, and they defend territories. And what they found is when there was more rocks, if you added rocks, they end up defending a smaller territory. And if you remove the rocks, they defend a larger territory. I always imagine they got some grad student out there that is trying to get a PhD and trying to better themselves, and now you got them out there moving 40,000 pounds of rock from one place to another, and then they got to move it back to see what happens. Grad students such as myself often get tortured in some ways for the better cause of learning, but that's just how it goes sometimes. Anyway, so what they found was if you remove the rocks and you had less rocks, bigger territory, more rocks, smaller territory. But no matter what, the scenario ended up about the same, where each lizard ended up with about one female. So males defend the territories and females end up picking the male with the territory. But whether it was a big territory or a small territory with lots of rocks or very few rocks, you ended up with the same result, which is about one female per male, which suggests they're adjusting the territory size, not so much just based on the rocks, but in order to attract a female. So it works out that way. Sometimes those territories will change based on food as well. So this bird here is called a pied wagtail, and it will move along the bank of a stream looking for food. And if it's finding food and another pied wagtail comes along, they might attack it and run it off. But sometimes they'll allow the bird to stay, which is kind of unusual. And we'll call that a satellite. A satellite is any kind of animal really that is sort of outside of the behavior you're kind of looking at that time. So if you're watching one bird feed, for example, the bird next to it coming in is a satellite. We do this a lot of times with the reproduction. So we'll have a male and a female, and there'll be what's called a satellite male that kind of tries to sneak in. We'll get more on that later on. But what's interesting here is sometimes this pied wagtail will allow that satellite, and the idea is that maybe the two birds together could run off a third competing male, or might also be that, let's say this is the original bird. This bird knows, for example, maybe it's already spent a lot of time over there, and it knows there's nothing there because it ate it all. So it's over here and it's watching this one. It's like, what's that going to do? Because there's nothing over there. Already ate all the food. So anyway, we call that sometimes byproduct mutualism. We'll talk more about this later on, but that's when sometimes animals will cooperate in unexpected ways because the two of them get a job done you couldn't do on your own. But we'll do more of that later on. And then we have migration. And there's all kinds of very interesting examples. You probably heard maybe recently about the wildebeest migration over parts of Africa. We're finding with climate change that maybe that is changing drastically. And birds do some of the most impressive migrations of any animal really on the planet. And so we're talking about habitats and territories that tend to change a great deal, particularly like in the northern or very southern parts of the polar regions where the weather can be so drastically different. The food supply can diminish, and so birds and other animals often move relative to the food. And there are many great examples of that and how they do that and decisions they have to make along the way. This bird here is called a red-eyed vireo. And they tend to migrate from parts of the southeastern portions of the United States. And they tend to head south like lots of things do. Birds fly south for the winter. And they go into parts of Mexico and Central America and so forth. And what they found is there's two ways you could go. You could go straight across like that, or you could go this really long way like that. And what they found is birds with low fat reserves, okay, low fat reserves, if you watch the direction they're going, so they haven't stored up enough energy. They're kind of lean, let's say. They tend to take the long way around the Gulf of Mexico. Notice, Gulf of Mexico. So I'm going to ask you this. I'll have a quiz question on this, one of my favorite ones. And people come up and they go, two of these are the same answer. So I don't know which one to put. It's been happening for years. And I go, no, they're not the same. You got to read them carefully. No, they're both the same. And because I'll have Gulf of Mexico, which is right? But then I'll have Gulf of California. And I think our brains just don't see that. Okay? The Gulf of California is not in this picture. It's way over this way here. So we're talking about Gulf of Mexico, not the Gulf of California. Okay? So birds with low fat reserves, they take the long way. Birds with high fat reserves go straight across. Now, the idea is if you go straight across, if you have a high fat reserve, you can afford to take the risk, go straight across. Okay? It's a long distance. It's a shorter distance than going all the way around, but if you have a high fat reserve, you can fly all the way across the ocean there and make it to the other side because you have enough energy to do it. So if you have the energy, saves you a whole bunch of time and you get to the feeding ground sooner. If you don't, you go the long way like this. And for two reasons. One, you can rest along the way, but the idea is also maybe you can pick up food as you go. So you can be eating as you go. So two different strategies there. Now, the other thing that's interesting when we talk about animal behavior and migration is how do they know how to do that? How do they know how to go from one place to another? And there are several different ways animals do this. And we'll talk about two sort of very, very different mechanisms by which we figure out where we are. And then we'll talk about different sensory systems that different animals use to be able to do that. So the first is called piloting. And piloting is where you're going along and you recognize landmarks. Okay. So you can't, like if I said right now, point to the direction that's northeast, you'd have to probably think about it. You'd have to think about where am I right now? Which way's northeast? Let me get a compass out. Some we do this in class. Some people just can't do it. They're pointing all kinds of different directions. We don't have a good sense of direction compass wise. Even if you do, some of you are like, oh no, I have a great sense of direction. If we took, a paper bag, spun you around upside down, put you on an airplane, flew you around different places and let you out and say, okay, which way's north? Humans aren't very good at that. You might look at the sun. If you have special skills, you might be able to kind of figure it out that way. If you know stars, you could maybe figure it out. But we don't know. We don't have a feeling of north or east or south. We kind of memorize it. So when we are driving home, for example, we navigate by what's called piloting, which is we recognize landmarks. I was driving home about 2 years ago, driving home. And like most people, which is kind of scary when you think about it, you kind of zone out. You're driving, you're thinking about what you're going to do when you get home. You're thinking about dinner. You're thinking about what you got to study. You're thinking about your boyfriend, girlfriend, your kids, whatever it is. And you're operating your vehicle, driving, and you're kind of not thinking about driving. So anyway, I'm going. And all of a sudden I realize I missed my exit, which we've all done. We've been driving home and missed our exit before. No big deal. Went home. Next day, I'm driving home, doing the same thing, kind of zoning out. Missed my exit again. So now, and I've driven the same way many, many times. So now 2 times in a row, I have zoned out and missed my exit, which was really odd. So the third day, I'm driving home and I'm like, okay, I'm not going to think about anything except what's happening. So I'm driving and I'm like, okay, here's my exit. My exit's coming up. And what I noticed was at my exit, there were all these big eucalyptus trees and they had cut them all down. for whatever reason, I don't know. But they were all cut down and they were on the side of the road. City was cleaning up, or, they decided to remove them. But my brain, without me really knowing it, I couldn't tell you the trees were there in the first place. But my brain was keying in on those trees. That was part of my visual image. Seeing that was a piloting landmark for me. And when they removed them, I didn't realize I was where I needed to get off. Okay? That's called piloting. Recognize landmarks. And whatever city that was messed me up twice by removing the trees, but I got a good story out of it. Compass orientation is quite different. Compass orientation is the ability to actually tell a very specific direction. And there are many animals that can navigate and migrate without using piloting, but compass orientation. They can tell actually where they are on the earth. And I'll give you some examples and how they do that. And there's various interesting sensory abilities animals have to do that. If you've ever been up to Santa Barbara and other places on the coast of California, probably other places too throughout the United States and Canada that I don't know, in Mexico. But anyway, there are these big, huge colonies at certain times of the year of these monarch butterflies when they're doing the migration. And there's like millions of these butterflies. And it's really neat because you can actually hear, there's so many of them, you can hear their wings flap. And so one really neat study they've done is you can take the butterfly, and butterflies, they migrate, so they're flying, and you can hook, they have these really tiny sensors now where you can hook the butterfly up to a little tiny sensor that's glued on its back. And there's a wire that goes to a computer that reads where the butterfly is trying to go. So the butterfly starts flying, and because the little sensor is glued to the back, it can sense the direction the butterfly is trying to go. And what they found is, and this always takes me a second to wrap my head around, and this is why they're in this weird order B, A, it's not A, B, C, which is what you expect. But let me start with C. Okay. Now, normally in a normal population, if you go out in the wild at a certain time of year when the migration starts, the natural population of these monarch butterflies, they'll fly south. Kind of like the birds. That's what C is showing you. They fly south for the winter. Okay. And then we'll go over to B, because B and C are kind of the same. So these are raised in captivity. Okay. So these are butterflies that you raised in a lab. They're not out in nature. They're in a lab somewhere. And the first 5 minutes of the autumn migration, like when all the other butterflies start to fly at a certain time of year and certain time of day, the captive bred ones fly like the natural ones. They fly sort of south. Okay. So there's something genetically built into them. They don't have to be out in nature to find it. They have this internal sense that they often call it migratory restlessness in birds. But there's a sort of this built-up anxiety that the animal's in the wrong spot, and it relieves that feeling by moving the correct direction. Okay. Anyway, those are captive bred. Okay. And then released in captivity. They're ones raised in captivity. Now, what they did, this is the interesting one, is A. Okay. What they did here, these butterflies are what are called clock shifted. So what they did was they raised them the same way as B, right? They're in a cage and they're growing and they're becoming butterflies. But what they did is they clock shifted them. And so the way you do that is you slowly change the time of day a little bit each day. So if you're in a lab somewhere, most of these animals have lights that turn on and they're on a timer. And the lights turn on at, say, 7 a.m. and they turn off at 7 p.m. Okay. And they've done experiments on humans and all kinds of things. And you can clock shift kind of any animal this way, 7 a.m., 7 p.m. But then what they do is they to clock shift them every day or two, they do it a little bit later, like 7:15, 7:20, 7:30. And then they turn them off a little bit later. Okay. And I don't know how long they did it for, but they do it over a period of time where basically the clock shifted ones are 3 or 4 hours off the natural ones. Okay. And so what they do is those butterflies fly west. So, which is interesting. They fly west because when they get out and start to migrate, it's almost like if you had them in California, it's like they woke up and they saw the sun. They use the sun to do this, it turns out. And it's like they're in New York and they're supposed to be in California by that time. So they have a sense that this isn't right. They're in the wrong spot. And so they end up flying west instead of south to sort of get to the right spot before they fly south after that. And they do this all over the United States. So we're mainly talking about ones that are going along this way. And then we clock shifted them to think they're over here. And they do that. Okay. Another one that's really impressive is the migration of sea turtles, which can go all the way around the world. One example, they'll go to the Ascension Islands and migrate between there and Brazil. You're talking like, miles and miles and miles of open sea with nothing. There's nothing out there. Maybe stars at night, but there's no buoys or anything of that sort. And it turns out what sea turtles use, we now know, is they use the Earth's magnetic field. So you can take a sea turtle and you can put them in a big like tank, like you see here, like a big pool, if you will. And what they do is the sea turtles, in this particular case, it's a green sea turtle. And what they did is the sea turtle's swimming and it's trying to migrate from one place to another. And what they do is if you were to go, in this particular case, they're doing this study in the southeastern United States. But if you go to, say, Florida and you take a compass reading, there's a different compass reading that you sense GPS compass wise on this part of Florida versus that part. But this is where they actually are. And what they can do is in that big, let me go back to that, inside this big sort of enclosure, they can change the magnetic field to all kinds of different things. And so what they found is and this is where they really are, if they change the magnetic field to match this part of the United States, sea turtles start swimming that way. If they change the magnetic field to this part, sea turtles start swimming this way. And you can do it they're kind of not the most, I don't want to offend sea turtles, but they're not doing calculus, okay? They're a very simplistic, well-designed animal for the sea, but they don't think, I don't think, really deep thoughts. Because, and that's maybe I'm overemphasizing it, but you can do this and change that magnetic field in a few minute scenario, and the sea turtle will change directions. So you can have it swimming this way for an hour or two, change the magnetic field. That same sea turtle will turn around and start swimming that way. They don't seem to notice, like, I was weird. Like, wasn't I just going that way? They just keep moving. This bird here is a bunting. I think this one's the Indigo Bunting. It's coming up next in the next slide here. There's several kinds of bunting. I'm pretty sure this one's the Indigo Bunting. And they use, in this particular case, if you've ever been to the Griffith Observatory where they can put the stars up on the ceiling and you can see different times a year where the stars would be. What they do with the bird is there we go, Indigo Bunting. Yay. And they use this thing called an Emlyn funnel. And the Emlyn funnel has an ink pad in it and then this big circular sort of piece of paper. And as the bird tries to fly or migrate, it lands on the ink pad and then it puts its footprints the sort of direction it's trying to aim. And so they can put this bird inside like an observatory with different skies at different times of the year. And here they're showing left and the middle, depending on the season, trying to go this way, trying to go that way. And here they found, like, if the night sky is obscured, like it's cloudy, you can see it's kind of random. They're kind of all over the place. This is a neat little lab that we kind of do. I'll just walk you through it for a really quick second here. But this animal here is called a pill bug, or you call it a roly-poly. It's a type of isopod. This is often kids' first pet. And animals often will move using what's called taxis. They'll have a direct movement towards or away from a stimulus. But sometimes it can be random. And so what we do is we set up as an experiment, this thing's called a choice chamber. And you can do neat things with this, but you can have one side or another side, and they can pick, and you can put ladybugs in here. You can use different kinds of small animals. These aren't very big, but this works really well with the roly-polies. And so you can cover one side up, say, with a cover, so it's dark, and the other side's open. You can put a chemical in one side versus another, and you can see and do little experiments on which one the animal ends up liking more. That's called a choice chamber, and we use them sometimes in lab if we have some extra time. But today we won't, obviously, because we're still in the crazy COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. But that's the end of today's lecture. Hope everyone's doing well, and I will talk with you soon.